Okay, perfect. I mean, no
I'm
problem.
starting it now just because it takes a second to set up, so it'll go live around 5:05 because it needs to configure.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. And if we are all set up, I welcome everyone to our well, almost weekly Scientist Rebellion talk. Thank you for joining. Thank you to the people who are looking at live stream. Today, our speaker is Nina Lakhani, who is a senior Guardian journalist a reporter for environmental issues, and the author of the book Who Killed Berta Caceres. Before that, she also worked in healthcare as a nurse. Thank you very much for joining and for being our speaker today.
You're welcome. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all.
So the talk today will be a sort of an interview. We will start with some questions that we prepared together with Nina. And after that, there will be space for questions which will come in the chat of Zoom or on the live stream and on our different platforms. So our collaboration and our meeting with Nina started some weeks ago, some months ago now, when we discussed about police violence on Ugandan activists and on the chance of reporting it on The Guardian. After one article that Nina wrote back in 2023, we went on with a following article about what was happening. And we will also come to that story later. But now, first of all, to introduce our guest, I would like to start from an older story, from a story about Indigenous activism and Honduras. So we start from the title of your book, Who Killed Berta Caceres? And who was Berta Caceres?
So Berta Caceres was an Indigenous Lenca leader from Honduras. I met her in 2013 when I went to Honduras for the first time. I was living in Mexico then, covering Mexico and Central America as a freelancer. And I met her at the end of 2013 during elections. And at that time, she was on the run from the police. There was an arrest warrant out for her on false charges. At that time, Amnesty International had said that if she would be arrested in jail, they would consider her a political prisoner. And she was leading a grassroots campaign to stop construction of a internationally financed hydroelectric dam on a river considered sacred by the Lenca people, which, if constructed, would many villages, many communities there depend wholly on that river for their animals, for agriculture, for life. And it would have been the end of those communities in that region. And so I interviewed her then at her home in Western Honduras. And I published a story I actually didn't publish it. I was a freelancer, and I think I published it in Al Jazeera. But I remember really clearly when I met her then, she was very sort of, she was just this amazing, convincing narrator. We knew her really as, I guess, as an Indigenous defender, but she was so much more than that. She was a political analyst. She was a sharp, like economist, really. She knew she had this amazing, unique talent of being able to explain local problems in international and regional, I guess, contexts. So I met her, and I remember then really clearly that she said to me, look, I can take all the measures I want, but when they want to kill me, they're going to kill me, and unfortunately, almost exactly 8 years ago, I woke up to phone messages saying that they've killed Berta in March 2016, and hitmen had entered her home like just about 11:30 at night and shot her dead. This was that, it was, and I remember waking up to that message and just I was actually on vacation at the time, and I remember saying to my friends, if they can kill Berta Caceres, they can kill anybody. And I think that was just sort of really true. She had, like, the previous year been awarded the Goldman Prize for Environmental Defenders, you know, which is considered the most prestigious prize in the environmental world. She'd had an audience with the Pope months earlier. She was by far the most, I guess, well-known environmental defender at that time in the Americas, you know, and they killed her anyway. And it really, I guess, it was very much, it showed you just how sure the perpetrators and the enablers were about impunity, right? And all of the you know, the dangers and all of the crimes and violence, structural and sort of direct, that we see against defenders, activists, scientists, you know, grassroots communities, is because there is impunity, right? Because there's either impunity, that there are laws that are not followed, or that we see now very much in the case of Europe and across the world, you know, of laws that are written to legalize the crackdown and the criminalization of defenders and activists. And just, you know, with Berta, like, I started investigate. I went to Honduras, started investigating her death. And as I started to uncover links between those that had participated in organizing and, you know, in organizing her murder, I found links with the Honduran military, with the US military. And as I started to report those links, I started to get threats myself. You know, I was sort of labeled a media terrorist, like, very early on, and very quickly I started having to take quite, you know, security measures myself. I never again, and this was 8 years ago, I've never again entered Honduras by plane. I always go in over land, because you know, things are just a bit more relaxed on those borders. And then when I was there, you know, I took a lot of care. I never published stories while I was in the country, for example. But when I covered the first murder trial, and so there was a murder trial, which was a miracle in itself. And it really, I think, came down to the international pressure, and also just her family and colleagues and friends. She was so well known internationally among Indigenous communities and many others, that there was a murder trial of the hitmen. And as that murder trial got started, I was the only journalist covering it. I started to get really direct threats. These press releases were sort of put out, accusing me of having links to Mexican organized crime, to having links to terrorist groups. And I was declared a persona non grata in Honduras by this false group. And we later linked those press releases to the Honduran military intelligence. But it was, like, you know, obviously a very, very stressful time. The advice from all the journalist groups was to leave the country. But that's, you know, I mean, I kept going with the story for years, because the more threats I got, the more I knew that I was getting to things that, you know, people with a lot of power, economic and political power, did not want to be out there, you know. And so, yeah, I mean, I sort of took lots of steps while I was there to create a big diplomatic noise. Really, the social, you know, the sort of the social movements, the sort of organizations and the non-profit organizations came up and supported me in such a way. They all backed me, like, online, and we really just tried to create this sort of, to make the political cost of something happen to me too high, you know, so that I could stay and cover the trial. But yeah, I mean, that was sort of very stressful. And then when the book was published, I had legal threats from a bank, threatening to sue because of contents in the book. And so sort of, and which I very much saw as a continuation, I guess, of the same sort of campaign of terror, really, you know, to stop any sort of information getting out about Berta and what she had uncovered herself. So yeah, that was sort of where that sort of story took me, I guess.
Thank you. That is an incredible story. That thank you for sharing and for covering it. Berta was fighting against. You started by saying that she was fighting against a dam, the construction of a dam that was menacing the indigenous community in Honduras. And now let's jump to the other story that we covered, that you covered recently, and on another big threat to indigenous communities in Africa this time. And so let's come to the story that brought us together. So the police violence in Uganda. This systematic violence against activists fighting the East African crude oil pipeline raised serious concern around the state of democracy in Uganda. and the interests of global North companies in East Africa are now undeniable. Can you tell us more about the situation that you had to uncover and about this fil rouge that connects companies and violence on indigenous activism in Africa?
I mean, I would just start by saying that, the specifics in each country, whether it be Honduras, the UK, Uganda, there are peculiarities in each country, but the modus operandi is very similar, right? I think, and that's a really important thing I try to do in my reporting, is to connect the dots. The criminal, the violence against communities and activists. Yes, it has particularly local expressions, but really it is, wide, it's the same economic and political powers, and the same, and really a repeat of the same, I guess, tactics, both in terms of repression by police, and which are backed obviously by the police can't succeed if they don't have the courts and the prosecutors, they don't have the laws in place, right? That's the same in all the countries. I think what's, the difference is probably some of the direct violence, like the sort of, having, it's not always people in police uniforms that will go, that, Berta wasn't killed by somebody in a police uniform. That doesn't mean it wasn't a state-sponsored crime, right? Is that sort of, I guess, there are differences. I mean, in Uganda in particular, you have an autocratic regime, which has shown itself for many years to apply these repressive criminal, both directly violence, but also sort of criminal crackdowns on all sorts of communities, on LGBTQ community, on political opposition, on anyone that threatens the political and economic status quo. So that's the context and panorama that the East African pipeline enters. And that's why it enters, right? You have there a landscape, a legal and political landscape, where international companies have the support, right? They are enabled and have the support to impose projects, right, which are going to cause huge amounts of environmental harm, and without observing and climate have a huge climate consequences for decades to come, where it is much harder for communities, grassroots communities, and impacted communities, and non-profits and activists and others to demand their rights. Their rights on paper may not be as strong as in other countries. In some cases are, in some cases not, but also it's just harder in that sort of, I guess, in that particular context. So, for example, the NGOs in Uganda have been criminalized as well, right? So it is, and Tanzania, it's even worse. Like in Tanzania, where the president owns all land belongs to the president, right? And so really, it's been incredibly difficult for Uganda. Has an incredibly strong civil society, like really, really excellent social, environmental groups, legal groups, advocacy groups, who have been repressed, really horrifically, in order to make it incredibly difficult for them to support grassroots activists, whether they be the students, who I've really focused on in my reporting, but also at a much, much more local level, kids, moms, like just families whose land, who believe they have not been given fair compensation for their land, who have ended up in these refugee camps, who are now facing real sort of struggles to provide for their families, because the land in which they cultivated has now gone, which their water streams will be contaminated if the project goes ahead. And so I think it's like about developing this sort of landscape. And I just said, you see the same thing happening all over, right? And we last year did a series looking really at the globalization of criminalization of defenders. And I went back to Guatemala, to an indigenous community in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, in the department of San Marcos, where a Canadian mine had entered like 15 years ago. And that's really one of the very first documented cases that we have of community activists being criminalized, being jailed, and having that threat of criminalization and the impact that had. And it was so successful that it was rolled out in Guatemala, then rolled out in Latin America. And you really see the roots of that sort of criminalization now taking place all across the world, including Europe, the US, Canada. Really, you can see the sort of, the real sort of seed of that being born in Guatemala 15, 16, 17 years ago. And, and I've spoken and interviewed, like the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawler, and others, are really clear saying states copy from each other, they really do. So the crackdown on NGOs by going after them in terms of, going after them in terms of their financial links started, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was either Eritrea or Ethiopia, one of those two countries. I can't remember now, but it was one of those two. It started there, and it's now been rolled out, states it's working. And right now, the criminalization of protest in Europe, everybody is looking to to England and Wales, right? Because it is, you're seeing people who are, slow walking being put into jail, right? I mean, it's like crazy. So you see, the climate crisis, you see laws being put into place that are utterly unjust and, arguably unconstitutional in many countries, right? Being used in order to stop protest and stop, peaceful protest against hugely impactful, fossil fuel projects, mining projects, environmentally damaging projects, like projects that are going to really just, which the climate cannot afford to progress. And so I think really important in the Uganda story and in all of these stories is, for me, is like to connect the dots, to not see what's happening in Uganda or Honduras or to the Indigenous people in Canada or to students in London as separate. They are all, because the economic, the big powerful companies and the governments are all they're all connected, they're all learning from each other. And I think like it's a sort of, as reporters, as activists, it's sort of really incumbent on us to make those links, because they really are very, part and part of the sort of same, landscape.
Thank you very much for the insightful reply. And let's keep on working on those dots and making these connections. And going into, we were talking about what happens when against protesters, what happens against civil defenders, for example, Berta Caceres, the students in Uganda, the people in the UK. But another part of the climate fight frontline is what happens after disasters. And recently, you were in Maui working with scientists that are analyzing the impact on health and on the economy of the territory of the recent wildfires. Something that immediately Indigenous communities in the regions were alarming is that people were coming after the disaster looking for land. So there is a danger in the aftermath of a disaster, and there are plenty of impacts. Can you tell us more about what's going on now in Maui?
Yeah, I mean, disaster capitalism is probably one of the grossest sort of expressions of capitalism that we see, right? So yeah, I was in Maui in January, just as the 6-month anniversary of the wildfires was approaching. I'd been very keen to go because I was actually there 2 years ago, reporting with some Indigenous farmers on how they are trying to recreate ancient food forests, using modern techniques with traditional knowledge, and in Lahaina, exactly where the fires were. And then to see, watch on TV, seeing this whole community wiped out was like devastating. So I went back and I did a few different stories, focused on, obviously, I mean, housing. And if you want to, is such a, when we talk about connecting the dots, this is exactly what I mean, I guess, sort of not just geographically, but my job as climate justice reporter, I very much see as sort of understanding and connecting the dots between the climate crisis and all the other structural issues that people are facing, right? Because the climate crisis is a risk. It exposes and exacerbates threats that people are already facing, right? It's a risk multiplier. So in Maui, where there has for more than a decade been a really debilitating affordable housing crisis, because not because there isn't enough housing, but because vacation properties, so people with second homes, people with holiday rentals, just buy up all the homes and rent them out on Airbnb and other sort of, you know, sites. And yeah, I mean, it just obviously just creates a huge, you know, there's just creates a huge demand and the prices go up. So now the fire happens, this has just, you know, exploded. Everybody on the island had been pressuring, you know, begging the governor to impose a moratorium on vacation rentals. But after you know, tourism was brought back in within a couple of months and everyone's flooded back. And it was, you know, even while, you know, I was there in January, there was still 6,000 people who'd lost their homes in hotel accommodation with nowhere to go. And they were in these hotels that were filled with like spring breakers and tourists taking selfies. Right? I mean, it was like just, you know, it was like awful. So that's, you know, so that's sort of the housing part. I mean, in terms of the scientists I, you know, hooked up with, there was some scientists, some researchers from the University of Hawaii on the Big Island have put together this amazing project, which is going to hopefully be 10 years, but it's looking at the monitoring the long-term consequences of the exposure to the fire. And the thinking behind this is that when you look at major disasters, whether it be 9/11, I was in East Palestine a year ago when you had the terrible train derailment, the big chemical explosions, all of these big disasters, you see 4, 5, 6, 10 years later, people who were exposed at the time, whether it be residents, first responders, you know, clusters of diseases happening, right? And then it's left on, you know, it's left to, I mean, I should say, those who are impacted and their families to then convince, to then, you know, whether it be lawmakers or insurance companies, that the health problems that they have are related, right, to the exposure that they had. So this study started like now 6 months, even that feels a little bit late, but 6 months tracking hundreds of people. I think they've got funding for 1,000 people. They're trying to get funding for 1,000 more. So getting baseline figures already, you know, of you know, like all the biomarkers. I'm not explaining this very well scientifically, but looking at that, you know, so even very quickly they were able to see high rates of like, you know, starting to see inflammation in lungs. They were, you know, tracking people from now, and they have very good, I guess, baseline data from the state, from the island of Maui, and you know, from the wider Hawaiian population. They've got a control group from the Big Island, so of the same number of people. And the idea is, you know, to really do real-time, I guess, tracking of exposure, so that they very much see themselves as a prevention study. If they can early on start to track, you know, groups of people or clusters of people who have got certain types of you know, inflammatory responses, cellular changes, then get the prevention, get the interventions in early. They're also tracking mental health. You know, we know from post disasters that rates of depression, anxiety, as well as rates of suicide are higher in those impacted communities and amongst first responders. It's tracking that. Also economic sort of, I guess, indicators, looking at, you know, many people who lost their homes also lost their jobs, right? And a really significant number of people are way below the income that they had already. So, you know, and, you know, I was able to sort of go, they were, when I was there, they were doing their first recruitment events when people were going and sort of signing up. And, you know, as a journalist, I love collaborating, you know, like, you know, I can bring my reporting skills. I can, you know, there's lots that I can bring to it, but I'm, you know, I'm not an economist. I'm not a sort of, you know, I'm not a biochemist. I'm not a biologist. So to be able to collaborate, you know, is like I do a lot of collaboration, because I think that when we put our efforts together, it's much better, right? You know, I'm working on a story at the moment with the Union of Concerned Scientists, right? We're looking at sort of, and I've done this before, looking at meatpacking plants. And it's like, you know, they bring, you know, a mix of economists and other, you know, scientists looking at, I guess, like pollution data together. And I bring the report in and sort of making it real, making those numbers and the data real, from a sort of from a, you know, from a community perspective. From I can go there to where we're looking at and be able to do some reporting. And I think that to me is like the really most high impact sort of way we can work, those type of collaborations, you know, because I can reach all types of audiences, scientists can reach all other different audiences, right? And I think the more we do that, the more impactful all of our work can be.
Absolutely. You know, I was very hit now by something you said about this post-disaster management, how important it is to start now the baseline studies and to start reporting. And it resonated because in my home city in north of Italy, now they are starting to do the baseline studies about the PFAS, so these pollutants that go into the ground, and it's the in many chemical plants that have been built in the 60s in north of Italy. Now they are provoking a huge pollution, and some like this pollution goes into the blood of the people of the different places. And now it's much more difficult because there wasn't a baseline before. It's much more difficult to convince healthcare, to convince insurance about the necessity of taking some remedies. And so the importance now of the post-disaster management in Maui really struck me because of the importance of dealing with that.
Yeah, and you know, and one of the researchers is there's two main researchers. One is, I mean, they're both at University of Hawaii. One is Mexican and one is Hawaiian. And you know, they're very, very, you know, it's a 10, they're hoping for it to be a 10-year longitudinal study. At the moment, I think they've got funding for 5 years. But you know, to really then enable to provide, it's open source, right? So they're tracking everybody, everything's going to be sort of on the dashboard online, and to really then provide that information to traditional community healers who provide holistic, you know, mental health and physical health services to the population, right? For that to be a resource for them as well, you know. And I think, you know, even, I mean, I haven't lived in the US that long, but you know, I know even post 9/11, right? I mean, it was a battle for, in a system here where there is no public health system, right? It was a real battle for first responders, for impacted people, to convince, you know, members of Congress, to convince insurance companies, etc., you know, that, you know, what they were suffering was a direct impact. And I think having that baseline, you know, I think the Hawaiian researchers would say themselves, even 6 months, they feel like it's a bit too late, right? You know, like, you know, really you want to be getting in there as soon as possible. But yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a real lesson, and to have that sort of, I guess, flexibility, to have that, you know, the ability to respond, which I know science doesn't always work in that way, right? I know grants don't always work in that way. It sort of can be, you know, but I think it's really important when we're looking, if we want to be impactful, I think it's like, you know, we don't have time, right, in these things. Like, we have to sort of react quickly.
Absolutely. And one fascinating but also terrifying part of the climate crisis is that at the same time, we don't have time, but also attacks on so many different time scales, because what happened in Maui last year will have consequences that will last way past the day that we will remember that it was a wildfire. And we will need to deal with the emotional and with the physical consequences of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the mental health consequences, I mean, I used to be a mental health nurse, you know, so it's always something I'm interested in. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, you know, even like when I covered Mexico and Central America, I used to often work with Médicos Sin Fronteras, Reporters Without Borders, you know, who, you know, do all sorts of excellent work in the region. But in Mexico, they were very focused on doing crisis psychological interventions. You know, there would be at places along the sort of route of the train where people were traveling, and you know, people were en route, right? They were stopping for a day. Maybe they would do crisis sessions, one session with people, right, really to try and sort of fertilize them psychologically, that, you know, in all the traumas they'd experienced. And, you know, I think the mental health sort of the impact of, you know, whether it's, you know, migrant sexual violence, the climate crisis, all of these things, you know, a disaster, it's sort of, you know, it's sort of sometimes sort of a secondary. And I just think, yeah, we can't, because in a long-term impact for individuals, families, communities, it's so, you know, it's so huge.
Absolutely. And you mentioned also that the climate crisis is something that you are interested in because it connects and worsens crises that are already there. And you also mentioned the importance of being precise with the data and working with different multi-layer, multidisciplinary approaches to do the best possible jobs. Some of the work that you recently did on The Guardian dealt with one of the most complex and tragic problems of today, that is the genocide unfolding in Gaza. And as scientists have mentioned multiple times, we made clear that the environmental impact for us is a secondary reason for condemning the situation, because human rights are at the core of our values. Nevertheless, the work that you did and the precise of the details of your reporting were really like stuck us, and it was important for us to enable some reporting on the climate impact on that conflict. You reported on the huge impact of the bombing, the supply chain fueling Israeli army with oil, the environmental cost of the military complex. Can you guide us through some of the information and how connected are the climate crisis and these other these other crises, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's been, I mean, you know, like I can't think about anything but Gaza, right? I mean, and the genocide unfolding, it's really hard to focus on anything else. And so I've really looked for a way. And I fundamentally believe what, that we can't talk about climate justice or environmental justice while there's genocide going on. I mean, they are, when there is occupied land, how can it be climate just? Climate justice and environmental justice can't just be for me and you. It has to be for everybody, right? And so, and actually, so I've tried to focus. Obviously, I'm not there, but I've tried to focus, try to bring focus my reporting on where I have some expertise. So I've looked at the climate impact, and I'll tell you, I guess, the story about how that came about. Fossil fuels' role in the current military bombardment of Gaza, but I've also looked at water and food. Which there is no life without water and food, right? And those have been systematically targeted by Israel before October 7th. I mean, just to say that I think in November, I did a story with the Pacific Institute, which is an institute in on the west coast of US that monitors water and violence across the world. And we found, and they monitor it in very, very sort of minute detail. And when we looked at the data between the start of 2022 and mid 2023, so before 7th of October, Israeli settlers and Israeli soldiers attacked civilian water supplies in the West Bank more frequently than Russia attacked water supplies in Ukraine, right? So this isn't new. Attacking, and by attacking, I mean armed settlers and soldiers going to a Palestinian's house and filling their water well with poison, with chemicals, or with stones, with cutting down their olive trees, with cutting their water irrigation systems. And the restriction of food, which I think you can't think about the environment without thinking about food and agriculture, limiting a Palestinians' right to nutrition, to food, to adequate food, has been a long-standing Israeli policy, right? So I think this is a context in which we come in. So I've looked at both of those things as this has unfolded. But yeah, I mean, the story about the emissions, when I was at COP28, which was honestly, I don't know, it was so surreal. We were so close to Gaza. I don't know, I'm sure some of you were there. And I was obviously reporting and trying to report some of the sort of small protests that were permitted. Protesters who mentioned Israel were threatened with having their badges revoked. It was so repressive. And I went and I interviewed the Palestinian climate minister. She's like the head of climate for the environment ministry. And we were just talking about all sorts of things, and she said to me, and what about the climate impact of this? We're at these climate talks, and what about the climate impact of this war on Gaza? And it sent me just down this rabbit hole, and until I found, and I realized then that actually the climate consequences of climate, measuring the greenhouse gas emissions linked to militarism wars is so new, and so there's so few people doing it. And then I managed to find some scientists and researchers who had been doing it. And over Christmas, we made an agreement that they would they were interested in looking at this, right? And we sort of made an agreement that we would collaborate on this together. And they calculated, and I would say it's definitely an underestimate of the first 2 months of the conflict of the greenhouse gas emissions, looking at jet fuel from the US, looking at sort of bomb attacks, aerial attacks, looking at, and also the reconstruction, right? Because a third of all of our I think it's a third of greenhouse gases are construction related cement, right? So looking at that for the first 2 months, and it's the first time that that had been done in real time during a conflict, and obviously, and I just thought it was just actually got some criticism for it on social media. People telling me I was like, it was ridiculous to be thinking about the climate consequences when genocide was going, when there was, there were so many human rights violations, people being killed. And I'd obviously thought about that quite seriously. I don't accept that criticism, in the sense that I think, that climate impact is human rights impact, right? These are all interconnected, and I think it's really not it's not beneficial to think about the climate crisis or environmental damage as separate to human rights. You know what I mean? They are so interconnected. And why can't we, at the same time as we're like denouncing and recording and looking at the starvation of children and the killing and the genocide of people, why can't we at the same time also measure and try to put, and look at the climate consequences, look at the climate minister Hadil, she said to me, before this, the biggest threat I would have said was facing Palestine was the climate crisis, like in terms of actual, the sea level rise, the drought, such intense population, like density of population. I mean, this is going to impact, the whole region, and everybody, right? And so I don't see why we can't do both at the same time. And then the most recent story, sorry, it's a very long answer, was when researchers came to me, and because I have been reporting on this, right, to look at, Data Desk had been commissioned to look at which companies, which fossil fuel majors, and which countries continue to supply fuel to Israel, and were able to show that the Israeli sort of military and armed forces and civilian fuel is very connected, right? And because we can see that from where the supplies go, where the refineries that they have, and other evidence that we detailed. And which of that specific, and to look at that since October 7th, but also since the ICJ ruling, right? So, for example, the US has sent one tanker of jet fuel specifically for Israeli military jets after October the 7th, when already 15,000 Palestinian civilians were dead, and then sent a second one after the ICJ ruling, which really, I think, raises a question of complicity in the genocide, right? Given the ruling, and other countries, have done similar things. And so, I think documenting this, I think it's wrong to say, that we're distracted. What that, the idea that I'm not caring about people's lives and human rights, not at all, but as what can I do? I'm not there, right? So I think it's incumbent on me and all of us to make sure all of the impacts and all of the consequences of this genocide are exposed in as much detail as we can, right? And I think we owe that to the Palestinian people. I think that we owe that, I don't want to look away. I want to look away, and I want to, and I feel so, I'm sure like many of you feel so guilty and powerless. I pay taxes in the US and the UK, right? I feel so like impotent. So I think what can we do, as well as showing our solidarity, is to use the knowledge and resources that we have as scientists, as journalists, to expose every single inch of the consequences of this genocide. And that's what I feel like I've tried to do, and to a tiny little extent, because there's so much that we don't know still.
Absolutely. And it's weird because in the climate movement, there are environmental groups that on the other side have been saying we cannot focus on single conflicts while there is so much on the climate crisis that is coming. And so it is weird that somehow both reporters feel somehow the pressure of, there are so much else that we should cover. And instead we are storyteller, and we try to cover what we feel like it's worth covering. And anything that we cover and that you cover will have an impact. For example, in the last journal article, you also reported that the military emissions are so underestimated because thanks to the US, reporting the military emissions is not compulsory for countries, and so we don't actually know how much these huge military complexes impacting the climate.
No, exactly. And I also just think, that, and I'm saying this as a journalist, but also just as a human being, right? If we can turn our back to children starving because of a genocide, it's not that far away to turn our back to children starving because of drought or because of floods, right? It's like, it's, and there are, I've done a lot of reporting on children starving in malnourishment and children starving in Guatemala because of successive years of drought, right? How do we get people to care about that if we don't care about people being, the starvation of children and of Palestinians we've never seen starvation so quickly to so many people in modern history. It's never been seen. And if we can turn our backs to that, we can turn our backs to children being malnourished in the US and the UK and all these other places, right? So it's like, I feel, I don't see how. I feel like you either care or you don't, and these are all interconnected struggles. They're all interconnected injustices, and
So there are a few questions that came from the live stream. So the people here in Zoom are lucky because if they want, they can now raise their hand. They have questions, and we will unmute you. There are also some questions from the thousands of people in the live stream that are following this on Twitter, and I thank you all the people that are following that. So let's start. Maybe on Zoom, someone has a question. Otherwise, we go to the ones in the live stream. Oh, there is Skylar. There's a question. Can some of the co-hosts unmute Skylar? Skylar, you're good to go.
Okay. Hey, yes, I'm Skylar. Thank you, Nina, for this whole presentation. I'm very grateful to hear about all the work you're doing. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned all the institutional corruption and students in London. So like I'm a researcher on the energy side of things. I see that corruption coming through, that talk of, oh, let's just implement a plan. I'm like, isn't that going to cause genocide? Like, not only are we emitting emissions bombing Gaza, but I also think the oil companies are trying to get the reserves underneath Gaza. And that hasn't seen enough discussion. And one of the big challenges I've been trying to figure out is where can I be most effective at this when the institutions inherently don't want us to do that? And there's inherently even more and more corruption in our research groups as the years go by.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess, I always come back to this saying that it's always about the natural resources, right? It's always about the land. It's always about the water. It's always about, the natural resources. And you're right. I mean, the sort of the occupation of Palestinian territory, right, and the continued occupation and the continued sort of settler, sort of illegal settlers, is about water, access to water and access to land, right, and access to fertile land. When it comes to energy, it's an interesting point because when I was at COP, I also interviewed the Israeli climate envoy and a representative and an official from the State Department, right? So the foreign ministry. And I asked them about, there's a big gas reserve in the sea in Palestinian territory, right? And so in June, I think the summer of last year, there was an agreement made between the Palestinian authorities and Israel to extract that gas, right? As a deal was made, and that deal was it was announced that they were going to make a deal, and that work was ongoing. And I asked about that. Now, it's an interesting question because what's going to happen to that, right? The deal was going to be something like Israel, and I don't know what foreign international companies would come in to extract it, and that the Palestinians would be given a certain amount of access to that energy, right? Where that stands now, I think it's something that's really worth following up. I don't know if there's been any progress in that. Do you know what I mean? Obviously it's in Palestinian maritime sort of territory, but that's never stopped Israel before, right? I mean, fishermen can't go out there or whatever. So I think that is an area it's worth following up with. And I think, because that, and also I guess the route, I just looking at sort of that last story that I did, where that fuel, when the companies that are coming from, I mean, not a single company. I've approached all of the major oil companies, right? Not a single one of them even bothered to respond, right? Either said no, can't respond. And so I think looking into more detail about that, where that, especially since the ICJ ruling, would be really interesting to do. Do you know what I mean? Because I think that the ruling's really clear. It's about all actors, right? And taking steps to ensure that genocidal acts are not carried out. So I think that gas field, that offshore gas field, is really worth exploring. I haven't gone back and looked at it. I should do that. But so I guess it's sort of just stagnant at the moment. But that, I'm sure, is very much on the Israeli sort of minds, like getting access to that gas source reserve. Sorry.
Thank you so much for the insightful answer, Nina. We have now a question from the live stream that will introduce Julia. I think, okay.
Hi, thank you very much. So if it's okay to ask you a relatively personal question, how do you look after your own mental health when you're reporting on such harrowing subjects?
I would say I have not been doing it very well of late. I mean, I think it's hard, right? It's hard. I mean, the idea that you're not impacted by, the trauma that you report on and you see, and just everything going on, like those feelings that I mentioned of feeling powerless and guilty and all of those things, right? Are really difficult, right? And it's like it's sort of sometimes you do a better job than others, but I think it's really hard. I mean, the idea that my job is to, like, I don't know, you can't, if you're not in, the idea that I could not be impacted, I wouldn't be doing my job very well. Do you know what I mean? I don't think, I think it's sort of course I feel it, and I feel, I do a lot of stories that involve spending time with people who are traumatized, right? And so at all sorts of different levels, and try to make those sort of interactions and those interviews and that time to be, well, at least not harmful, but potentially beneficial for those. I feel like I use my mental health skills all the time in my work. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, and sometimes it's easier than others. But I something that I think about, sort of, I guess, not traumatizing people I'm working with, or re-traumatizing people I'm working with, and then you try to sort of apply those same things to yourself. Do you know what I mean? But it isn't. Yeah, it's not always easy.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from Zoom, from Terry Rankin. I will ask you to unmute. Terry, we cannot hear you, I feel.
Is that better?
Now,
Yeah.
now, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hang on. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
You can ask a question.
I'm going to crack your video. Oh, sorry. Nina, I wanted to ask you, both generally and as specifically as you can from a journalistic perspective, how would you assess the state of activism domestically within what I call the United Corporate States of America?
It's really hard to make generalizations in the US because it's just, it's so big and all states are so different. I mean, I think that, there is a long sort of rich history of activism and, in this country. I think when you're specifically talking about environment and, climate, I think that an environment in particular, I think the leaders have been Indigenous communities. They've absolutely led the way, and they have taught, everybody else so much. Do you know what I mean? The people who have been able to open their hearts and listen and learn from other people, like, they have been, real leaders. I mean, I think, obviously things go way back. I mean, last year I did 2 interviews with Leonard Peltier, who's almost been in prison for 50 years, one of the longest serving political prisoners in history here, and arguably his struggle was it was about the land, it was about natural resources. It always is, right? And so I mean, and then I think a more recent line in the stand has been Standing Rock, and what we've seen since Standing Rock is almost half the states now in the US have implemented really severe anti-protest laws, national infrastructure protection laws, right? And I'm thinking about that now in the election context, right? What does that mean? What does that mean that voters will not know about, because the risk of protest is just too high for so many people? Do you know what I mean? So I think it has a real, so I think the activists are there. I think I'm in New York. I mean, there's 3-4 really well organized anti-genocide protests every week here, but the consequences are high. I mean, you see, the police are they feel very sort of what's the word, like confident in really being repressive in their sort of reactions, and a lot of these anti-protest laws absolutely have been designed and written by groups like ALEC and the economics sort of white elites, but and they are, I think you're seeing it all over the place. So I think that the idea that it won't have an impact just isn't true. Do you know what I mean? I think it's hard to know what you don't know, right? What protests haven't happened, but when you see places like, I don't know, let's take Idaho, I think it's like a good example. It's currently contemplating one of these very sort of like restrictive anti-protest laws. There's also lots of expansion plans for pipelines coming down from with tar sands coming down from Canada into Idaho, right? So a very Republican state, but really, what do sort of people have at their disposal if you want to protest against this type of infrastructure, this type of sort of this damage, because your voting Democrat isn't really going to get you very far in Idaho, right? But actually, and then going out and doing like civil disobedience protests will probably end you up in jail or with massive fines and criminal records. So it's like it has a very repressive sort of, I guess, impact. And 22 states, I think, since Standing Rock have implemented one or more, sort of really, including these terrible laws that a few states have got, including, I think Florida is one where a car driving into a protest would not be culpable even if the person was killed or injured, right? It would be, yeah. We can't hear you.
No, Terry, I have to ask you to unmute. You are still muted. Still muted?
Sorry, I didn't know I was still muted.
Right.
I live in Central Florida, the Ron DeSantis
Right.
kingdom of magical thinking. So I know exactly the law you're talking about, and a point of clarity that isn't easy to find until you look into the details of the actual statute is that all you're freed from is civil prosecution. Now, that's bad enough, but it doesn't take away the full criminal dimension of the act. But what it does do is it strikes at the illusion of courage that motivate the unknowing, for lack of a better word. It strikes at their courage to protest, to be defiant, to get in the face of the system. You see what I mean? And that, to me, is the real threat of all the legislature I've seen here. And from what I know of what's coming to the UK with working with, like Roger and others.
Well, I mean, I would go one step further. I think these laws are designed to create terror. In some way, some countries have used anti-terrorism laws, national security laws to crack down on peaceful protests about the climate crisis. What do you do? Right. So, connecting this, I guess, with Berta's, murder, there, when I wrote my book, what I found really clearly in her murder was really just a sort of implementation of counterinsurgency, the whole continuum, right? You don't start off by killing an activist that is causing you problems, that is delaying your project, right? What you start off by doing is spreading rumors about them. You have threats. There's like online bullying. You offer to bribe them. You conquer and divide the community. Criminalization, like murder is like the last resort, right? So you have this continuum of threats, but all of these things are designed to cause terror, to put other people off, to make people too scared to come out onto the street. These are like state-sponsored terror laws. Do you know what I mean? That's and some countries have used anti-terrorism laws to crack down on peaceful protests. They're called different things in different countries, but that it is right. It's getting at people's courage. These are getting in the US context. These are First Amendment rights, right? Do you know what I mean? The right to protest, the right to speak out, the right to, the right to free association, the right to your freedom of expression. These laws are absolutely getting at these, but so they're called different things in different countries, but it is about causing terror among people. And in Uganda, going back to Uganda, that's it, right? You target some people and you keep them tied up in court on these, you beat them up, you keep them in these terrible conditions. They're going to tell their friends about that, right? That you keep them in court, you just ruin their studies. Some of these kids, students have been now, they've lost the jobs that they had to support themselves at university. They've been kicked out of the apartments they were renting, the impacts on their family back at home. These are terror tactics, right? You spread, you pick on a small group of people and then it spreads, right? It's like and that's, and it's just state sponsored.
Thank you, Nina. I take just one moment first to thank the interpreters, because I think that their time is over because they committed to 1 hour. I also ask you, Nina, we have a couple or 3 questions from the live stream that we can still address. Would you mind staying 5 minutes? Okay. Sure. Thank you very much. So one question is, it's something that might come from our activists, because it's some greedy questions from an expert on media. How can we get the climate crisis on mainstream media? What are your tips to how can we create stories that go on public media?
I think building relationships with journalists, I think that's the main thing, and then, people come to me, I guess, individually, I think it's sort of picking journalists who interested. I think it's sometimes, I guess we are so overwhelmed, all of us. Do you know what I mean? Like every day there's things that we want to do and we can't do, and it's sort of, you're always torn between doing like long-term projects that are, that require a lot of time and resources, as well as things that are happening every day. It's wild to me that people are arrested for protesting the climate crisis, and we don't even report that every time now because it just happens so often. Things become normalized so quickly. So I think, for example, with ECOP, I've done 2 stories. Something else like quite significantly different would have to happen for me to do another story now, right? Because I just have like so many other things to do, I don't know, but build relationships with journalists, and offer to collaborate, I think, and give journalists time. Like when I get a press release or someone contacts me saying we're putting out this research tomorrow, it's just not enough time. Do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of like, go to journalists early, see if they want to collaborate with you, maybe do something because if it's an exclusive, I always ask for an exclusive, because then I can push for it to get more prominence here. If not, I can't, it's not that we won't do it, but the more time we have, because I've got that April 3 reporting trips, taking on anything else, no matter how good or important it is really hard, right? So to have time, build relationships with people, contact them directly, and offer to collaborate,
Thank you for your tips. We have another question from the stream that Tatiana was taking care of. Tatiana, would you mind asking?
Yes. Hi, Nina. Thank you so much for joining us, your time, all of this great information and everything that you do. I had a question about media suppression, because I know that that's sort of a widespread problem that journalists don't really get to talk about a lot because of suppression. So I was wondering if you could tell us sort of the different vectors that media suppression comes at journalists from, and also maybe about a time that a story of yours you felt was suppressed. And I know that, maybe you can't share a lot of details. And just as far as collaboration, I would love to collaborate with you further about upcoming actions on Wall Street, but that would be afterward. Anyway, yeah, so about suppression, just curious your thoughts.
I mean, I think, personally, I mean, all the stories I'm doing, a lot of the stories I'm doing, especially around Gaza, probably may well not have been published by other media outlets, right? So I think, it's that sort of, there isn't anything more, I guess, what's the word, like, I guess it's not controversial in my eyes, but it's divisive is probably a word, do you know what I mean, or like sensitive, and so, and there's not a story that I've wanted to publish or publish that hasn't been published. I think media, it depends who you are and where you are, right? I think especially local, regional media, but even national media, they depend so heavily on publicity, on advertising, do you know what I mean? And I think that makes things really difficult for some people, like, and I'm talking generally here, in countries like Mexico, for example, where one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist, where more than 100 journalists have been killed in the last 10-15 years, it's sort of, the threat, it's mostly local journalists reporting corruption at local levels. And so that, pressure comes from being threatened, your family being threatened, but also from local, a lot of the very local media rely on local governments to advertise in their newspapers, right? And so if you lose that, the newspaper closes. So I think there's that pressure, and I think that happens at all different types of sort of levels. And most news is local news, right? There is no, so that, and that would happen. And, so that can be direct or indirect, from advertisers, from other supporters. I mean, and I don't know, like, I mean, I guess as well, sources, if a particular local media is very reliant on particular, I don't know, whether it be politicians or whoever, as to give them sort of sources, and then they're going to publish something that's negative about their son, then there may well be pressure on that. But I think there's also just a lot of editorial, every newspaper has its own editorial bias, and like, I'm using the word biases in not necessarily a negative sense. It's like, we all, newspapers and their editorial sort of, I guess, missions are all distinct, right? And these are, I guess, for all of us, evolving. These are dynamic things, right, that we don't always get right, and there will be times when us as individual reporters feel that we're not getting it right. And how do we go about that? How do we go about raising those issues? And we've seen it in sort of major newspapers with the reporting on Gaza happening, still unfolding today. Do you know what I mean? And so it's difficult, right? Because it's also a very difficult environment. People's jobs are being lost every day, right? We're under, just here in the US, the last 2 months, LA Times, so many, BuzzFeed, Vice, all of these sort of, major news outlets have cut huge amounts of staff. There are, you feel really strongly about, you may feel very strongly about a story of yours that hasn't happened, but where do you go? Like, you still have kids to support and, like, food to put on the table. It's like, it's not easy, do you know what I mean, for people? And I think and we're not, and then you go to countries like, and I'm only talking about Latin America because that's where I know, and that's where I worked and lived for a long time, direct threats on people. I did a story last year with a Mexican journalist who had been kidnapped because she was reporting on violence in the state of Mexico due to her investigation. And and again, this comes into collaborations. You get strength in numbers. We had a collaboration, me at The Guardian, Forbidden Stories, which is a French sort of non-profit organization, Maria Teresa in Mexico, and another outlet in Mexico. And we helped finish. I went to Mexico for a while, and we finished the investigation together, and we all published it together on the same day, as a protective mechanism for her, and brought down a state government. It was but again, that's a strength of collaboration. I think that's really important, especially for local journalists, like, for example, in Uganda, where those local journalists will be under exactly the same pressure as the NGOs, as the activists as well, right? So I think collaborating and looking for those collaborations, like local journalists and international journalists, we try to do as much as possible of that. It's really hard work to do. I've been involved in quite a lot of big international collaborations, and it's a lot of work, because everyone's working in their own standards and their own means, but really the benefits are amazing, because you're all bringing different expertise and talent and knowledge and experience to projects. And the aim of it is to allow, you know, work from our colleagues who are under threat or who have been killed to continue, to like not to kill them, you know, this idea that we don't kill the message. If you kill the messenger, you're not going to kill the message, you know. And I think the repression of activists goes hand in hand with the repression of journalists globally, and we see that, you know. So yeah, I think collaborations are really, you know, really good protective mechanism for us all.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. I kept these questions on the last because I think it's a little bit a good summary of what we talked about. It's a question about connecting the dots, but on our sides, the side of scientists. How can often when we start talking about genocide, we on the 27th of January we made a long thread reporting 10 different genocides going on now in the world, and received criticism because that's not our topic. Our topic is the climate crisis. And this is somehow a failure of communication. It wasn't wide, the criticism, but still, how can we, do you have any tips to communicate better how the dots are always connected, and how can we be clear on that?
It's so funny that, well, it's not funny, but you say that. I mean, I remember back in October, like on one of my many sleepless nights after, you know, this conflict started, like literally going through the internet and looking at all the genocides that have taken place in my lifetime, right? And there was I mean, I lost, you know, so many, and then thinking as well, you know, why am I more upset and worried and active in one than other? Anyway, all of these questions, right? So, but I think, first of all, there's always going to be critics, right? No matter what you do and how you do it, there's always going to be critics. I think the idea that climate, like, why are we trying to save the planet? Like, why? Like, what is the purpose of it? It's because we're trying to save humanity, right? And all of the other species on it. So if that's our end goal and it's a shared goal, right, then actually the destruction of the environment and the destruction of the planet, however it's taking place, is absolutely key to that. War is disastrous for the planet, right? And we are part of that. Humans are not separate to the planet, you know, and that is all indigenous peoples understand as humans being part of the ecosystem, right? It's the same that flora and fauna is part of the ecosystem. We are part of it. We're a dynamic part of it. We're not separate from it. We're not dominant. We're not there. It's because of this sort of Western colonial capitalist mindset that we have dominance and ownership of the planet, that we're in this mess, right? And so it's like, if we're a part of the ecosystem, then any damage and destruction, and needless damage and destruction, which is what war is, right, is totally avoidable. That we have to connect those, you know, that's in the end, that's what we're all looking for, right? We're trying to keep the planet livable, trying to preserve and water sources, make sure that there's, you know, enough land and agriculture for everybody to eat, right? So all of those things, war is the most acute expression of that not being that not taking place. And so yeah, I mean, how you cannot connect the planet to human rights. I mean, like the right to a safe environment, you know, the International Court of Human Rights just last week passed a sentence in a case in Peru saying that people in the, you know, there is a human right to a safe and livable environment. They've just passed that, right? That's the highest court of the Americas. The Europe has already done that. I think in the UN has already passed something similar, right? So, you know, the idea that human rights and environment and aren't connected just doesn't make sense to me. But I think just sort of bringing it back and just like, what are we all, you know, we're trying to save the planet. That's what all the work around climate is, right? We're trying to keep a livable planet for everybody. So but war is just, you know, it's just destruction, and you know, you can't talk about, for me, how can we be talking about a healthy planet and saving humanity while ignoring the annihilation of a whole community? There is no buts. right? When you're talking about climate justice, environmental justice, if you've got a but at the end of a sentence, there's a problem there. Do you know? There is no buts, right? It's climate justice and environmental justice and a safe, healthy planet for all of us. Right? I mean, that's where I'm coming at it from, you know, anyway.
Thank you for the clear answer. So I actually oversaw one question about Mexico in the chat. Do you have time for a last question? Okay, it's Skylar. No, sorry, it's Santiago from the chat. Would you like to ask the question yourself? I can ask you to unmute. Otherwise, I can read from the chat.
Santiago said he would prefer if you read it out for him, please.
Absolutely. So Santiago wanted to ask about the dangers to journalists in Mexico. His understanding is that today, most of the dangers come from organized crime, colluded with local governments and colluded sometimes with mining companies, for example, that are trying to displace indigenous communities. What should a leftist presidents do to protect journalists and land defenders? And I think in general, what can we do to protect journalists and land defenders in Mexico these days?
Well, the reason, first of all, I mean, the common denominator in the, you know, for the most of the journalists who are murdered or threatened or attacked in different ways is that they're investigating corruption, right? It's so while a corrupt official might not pull the trigger, they might have like they hire a hitman, or they're in, you know, the corruption is with an organized crime group or a mining company or whatever. It is the investigation of corruption locally that is most likely to get you killed in Mexico. And the reason that journalists and activists keep being killed is because there is almost 100% impunity, right? These crimes are enabled often by corrupt officials that have enabled that. And, you know, and I guess it's like important to say, we're not talking about bad apples. We're talking about political systems that were designed and set up to operate like this, right? So everybody's doing a job, and everybody to maintain a status quo, to extract most benefit for a few people. And while those people and actors have changed over the years, right, it's still that sort of you know, most benefit, most resources for a few. And so it is that corruption, and it's sort of like that impunity that enables, if we were locking up people and we were going after both those who pulled the trigger and those who were the masterminds behind the crime, they would stop, right? Because actually your chances of getting caught and ending up in prison would be high. But there's almost 99, it's like a 99 or 98% impunity in all of these crimes. What doesn't help is having a president like the current president in Mexico specifically naming and targeting journalists every morning in his morning press conference. Any journalist or activist that is critical of anything to do with his government, he names them, to the extent that recently there was an investigation by the New York Times about alleged payments from a cartel to the current president's campaign. And when the Times bureau chief had written in asking for a response to these allegations, he read out her name, address, and phone number in his morning press conference, right? He makes journalists targets. And so actually, I lived in Mexico from early 2013, so the whole of the last government and some of this current one. It didn't start, you know, it didn't start with him. I mean, it's been really the war, you know, since the sort of US-sponsored war on drugs that you've seen is massive rise in killing of journalists. But it certainly got worse, right? The naming and target, you know, and this idea that, and he says this, you're either with me or you're my enemy. Target, you know, populist leaders, whether it's in Mexico or the US or Brazil or India, identifying to their sort of vast supporters, individuals, whether they be activists or researchers or journalists, as enemies of the party, of the political project, is the most dangerous thing that you can do. So not doing that as a starting point would be a step forward. But impunity, all of it, right? Whether you're talking about gender-based violence, whether you're talking about whoever, when you're talking about targeted violence against any group, the heart of it is impunity, right? If the impunity wasn't there, the crimes wouldn't be there.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you for all the stories that you shared with us and to your insightful answers. We titled this talk in our chat. We titled this talk the duty to tell, but at the same time, you talked about Berta Caceres. You talked about your work and the work of other people, that telling stories and going there and giving the details and collaborating with people can become a weapon for fighting for this against inequality. So thank you very much for your work. It was really a pleasure to have the chance of having a chat together and share a bit of your experience with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate all of you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Now, usually, after the talks, we for the people that participated on Zoom, we still we remain here for some minutes more as a way to get to know each other. We can make breakout rooms based on continent, so that people that participated in the talk and maybe in the same continent area, maybe have some questions about what Scientist Rebellion is doing, or maybe they have some questions to each other, they want to have a chat. So we also do these events in order to encourage people with a similar mindset and similar feelings to join, to get in touch and get to know each other. So, so yeah. I was told that we are not that many on, I see that we are now not that many on Zoom, so actually the breakout rooms can become a little bit scattered, but there is me and there is other people from Scientist Rebellion here. So if attendees on Zoom have some questions or want to share some thoughts, we can still have 10 minutes of feedback round and sharing if people want.
Yeah, thanks so much for everything, Daniele, and for everyone who organized this talk. I know some people have to leave for other meetings. Oh, Suzanne's coming back in. So I think, yeah, so we have about 14 people left. And yeah, does anyone want to kick off the discussion with any thoughts or responses to the talk? Like, what did you think about it? How did you find it? What other people would you like us to have on, or other topics would you like us to cover for future talks? Because we do these almost every week or twice a week sometimes. So any feedback would be great.
I see Skylar.
Yeah, go ahead, Skylar.
I asked her to unmute.
Yeah, I mean, the question that keeps popping up with me is just, how do people get involved in this? I am not a journalist by training, but I mean, she was talking about, all the physical science that connects in with this. And I mean, when you're dealing with institutions who don't want to hear that truth, I mean, even things as simple as where our climate targets are headed, that's inherently going to cause genocide, just from the physical impacts of all the warming, the crop failures, all of that. And we have even in California, we've got all these major institutions that are just I've tried to bring stuff and they're like, please shut the hell up. No one disproved anything I said. But they were really, really upset that I brought it up. And it's, I mean, I'm wondering that. I was trying to figure out what journalist protection programs there are. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the subject material is one thing, but then, where do you work? And especially, funding's different if you're not associated with an institution. Pretty much the moment I started posting stuff that was, actually addressing this, the whole cohort just ran away at 100 miles an hour from me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was an important point, actually, that she brought up about international coalitions between journalists, because one of the things I've been looking at is how do we create, because the people who are organizing to ruin our world are doing so internationally and are all colluding and have been for decades. So if we're not organizing on that level, we're not going to be as effective and efficient with this fight as we need to be. Terry, I will totally come to you. Thank you. So I thought it was fascinating that I was glad to hear that she was already doing that. And I was wondering, in what can we do? Because that vision of mine is, I can't believe I'm able to say this finally after 12 years of this idea, is being built. And it gave me the idea of building in a mechanism for journalists to be able to do that as well more easily, and make it more efficient for them to protect one another, because we need our truth tellers, and so few journalists nowadays have the opportunity, just because of the pressures and threats that they face and their families face, or, you know, in some cases, like the moral courage, even if not under threat, to be truth tellers. And we need to protect our truth tellers, be it in activism, in journalism, in politics, anywhere. Yeah, Terry, sorry, you were going to say something.
I was muted, sorry. In terms of getting involved, Skylar, you raised the specific question of what can I do? Well, don't worry about, one of the main things I think is just to summon the courage and the will to do something, which you apparently are doing. And that is a constant struggle, because knowing how to spend your time, you get accused of doom scrolling if you follow certain feeds. You get accused of lunacy if you live in a neighborhood like I do in the heart of the Magic Kingdom of random magical thinking, Ron DeSantis, Florida. When you are struggling to find that, one of the kind of voices that Tatiana was talking about that I follow completely, I mean, I'm devoted dozens of hours a week serving with him, Roger Hallam. He's got a new website, go to it, read his writings. That is an activism. Just to summon the courage and the will to listen to truth tellers like Roger is an action. It's nonviolent and it's direct, because you're going for the truth. So I'm really comfortable there, and I work pretty closely with Roger on a lot of stuff. For instance, he has monthly calls like this, Zoom calls. So start going to those. And there's a workshop coming up. We haven't set dates yet or anything, but there's like going to be a whole weekend where there will be parallel breakout room tracks to get involved in, and main room events featuring people like Roger and like an Australian philosopher that I work with who, well, he's more of a naturalist, but anyway, we're going to have featured keynote speakers. We're building these logistic details together now. We hope to have it this spring, but I'm thinking it's more likely going to be late spring, early summer. And so just start following your own intuition, your own will, and your own courage. Whatever strikes you at that heart that wants to get involved, follow it. And Roger, I think, is it's a great place to start. The flip side of that coin, though, is how do you get your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength wrapped around the enormity, the oppressive enormity of the challenge. And that takes a real, for me, spiritual kind of settling, peaceful, being present in the reality of it without being terrified by it. And that is not an easy place to get to. Meditation, nature walks, community groups where you can openly talk about this kind of thing. Find those that help you find that inner peace and bring it to the fight. Okay, that's my 2 cents worth.
Just some small organizational point. We are still live.
Yeah.
We think that like we can officially, since Nina has left, and now it's more of a personal talk, we can, I feel we can start to say bye to all the amazing people that followed the talk today. I hope you were as inspired as we were in the live, and thank you really much for joining. And I appreciate all of your work, and I hope to see you at the next meeting, at the next talk. And